Welcome to the Imaginaries.
All right. Oh, that's not actually how I want to start. All right.
All right.
So, welcome to the Imaginaries podcast. We are back again, and of course by we, I mean I and my intrepid co-host Kendra. Welcome back.
Aww. Hi.
Today we will be talking about AI. Artificial intelligence in science fiction. Science fiction specifically because I believe a discussion of artificial intelligences in fantasy or fictions that are not at least a little bit science-based would definitely be interesting, but is maybe beyond the scope of us talking for 40 minutes today. So let's maybe let's maybe bookmark that for later. Today, we're just going to focus on artificial intelligences in science fiction.
Smart robots.
And I want to start us off by just jumping us right in the middle. And here is a question for you, my intrepid co-host Kendra. So, when we talk about AI, are we talking about the alien?
Okay, so I have feelings about this question, and they are feelings of great confusion and distrust in my intuition, which is to say yes and no. And I find that that's a really problematic answer for a lot of reasons because it doesn't unpack any of the nuances behind why it's yes or no, or yes and no. So in many ways, when you look at AI's function in science fiction, and we can talk about some specific texts later, I would posit that in a lot of ways, it's a portrayal of the ultimate in the other, and the other being capital O, other, the alien, the ununderstandable, or perhaps the struggle for understanding and comprehending the self. So in a sense, everything from the Alien franchise to Blade Runner, to name a couple of movies, and the Culture series by Iain M Banks, to the Expanse. Actually, the showrunners have talked a lot about how there is AI in their universe, in spots and behind the scenes stuff. You know, the AI is present pretty much everywhere that you need a discussion about becoming or understanding the self. And so, yes, that would be the yes, that AI stands in for the alien. But also no, because in a lot of texts where you have AI, you also have distinctly different alien understandings or depictions. So I'm thinking of Star Trek as a good example where you actually have pretty fine differentiation between the alien and the artificial intelligence. And they're speciated in a sense, like they're distinguished by the fact that they're different people or different characters, and they're not operating always in the same way or on the same level. I think of Data, and I think of him compared to, say, the hive mind of the Borg. Oh my goodness, I was flashing to something from that old show V with the lizards.
Oh,
yeah, like
lizards.
I think of Data versus the Borg, and they are different thought experiments entirely. So that would be the no. And do you kind of see where I'm getting at, or what I'm getting at? In that it is both and that's really frustrating for me because I want to be able to give you a nice soundbite, and I can't. I'm just messy.
Yeah.
What do you think,
Perfectly
though? Like,
fine.
am I on the right track? Am I explaining things somewhat clearly, or is there a way that we can perhaps...
I think that you're answering the question just fine. And I think that my answer to that question would actually be a question. Or I think two questions, actually.
Frustrating.
First of all, is it possible for AI to be alien if they're made by humans? But then on the other hand, is it possible for AI to be anything but alien because they are not human? And by alien, I don't mean... By alien, I should say the alien.
In a sense, though, your
unknown.
question is a trick because
that's the
right,
best kind of question.
It's a little bit of a trick because in a lot of the texts that we could name, such as Battlestar Galactica or even Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, where the artificial intelligence of the ship is learning how to tell a story and write a novel. Even in these stories, the artificial intelligence is becoming human or learning how to behave more like a human or struggling with the distinction between being artificial and being human. And in the case of Battlestar Galactica, over the course of, 5 seasons, you have the Cylons cycle from the synthetic, the man-made, to being actual functional human beings who can't distinguish themselves, apart from the fact that they all look identical, from otherwise unsynthetic humans. And in a lot of texts, the AI struggles to comprehend how its thought processes are different, how collapsing quantum states might in some way actually replicate the human consciousness that we as non-synthetic humans, at least I'm assuming you're non-synthetic, Tony. We non-synthetic humans also find each other unknowable and struggle to comprehend each other, even though we're all quote-unquote human. So the distinctions really, really fade in a lot of these texts. And so your question is ultimately a little bit of posturing. And I'm curious how you came to that question and what it means to you. Or is it like kind of a way of getting us further into the conversation alone? Like, is it scaffolding, or do you have a question that I haven't answered that I'm maybe missing?
I think that the question I'm actually asking there is more rooted in what we mean by artificial intelligence and what we mean by human. And I know that's kind of a deeply philosophical divergence, so bear with me.
I'm here. I'm bearing.
So, even the term artificial intelligence is itself making those intelligences other. They're not natural, they're not human, whatever you want the opposite of artificial to be, that's what AIs are not, definitionally. So, is there, and taking the example of Data from Star Trek, or the Cylons from Battlestar Galactica, or plenty, and I mean, we'll talk about plenty more, and you've mentioned some already. The thing that they have in common is that they are not human, and others identify them as not human, and they self-identify as not human. In the case of Data, his quest is to become more human, to figure out what it is to be human at all, and that's a sidebar that's very awesome, and those are some of my favorite moments in Next Generation when Data does that. But, what I'm sort of wrestling with here is by calling AI artificial intelligence, by calling the concept of AI artificial intelligence, are we not doing it a disservice by saying it is fundamentally and essentially different from what it means to be human? And so the question I'm asking, is it possible for AI to be alien if they're made by humans, or is it possible for AI to be anything but alien, is really, those questions are really trying to get at the heart of what does it mean to be human, which is actually one of those big science fictional questions that over the decades science fiction texts have attempted to answer. And I feel like artificial intelligence as character, as plot, as MacGuffin, as device, as whatever in science fiction is another way to explore that. Once again, Data in Next Generation is that to a T. But what is artificial intelligence and what is human?
Well, and I think just to kind of spin out a little bit in perspective and look at the history of this science fictional question, as you said, it's there in Frankenstein. It's there
Yeah.
from the very beginning of science fiction as a genre. And I think there might even be some cool conversation that could happen around the fact that it was seeded and planted by a woman who really struggled to understand her place as a woman in a society run by men. She was used to being othered. She was used to her mother being othered. It was she came from a long line of people who struggled to understand their place in the world and how to interact with other people. And I think that whether you can draw tight connections between those two things or just kind of cool constellations of facts and convergences, I think that the heart of science fiction has always had room in it for the contemplation of this question without necessarily forcing a resolution on it. I don't think that Frankenstein ultimately calls down judgment on what's human and what's not human. I think it's a rather empathetic text, to be honest, especially for the time. So this is a question of empathy, right? How do we relate to others, human or non-human, manufactured or embryonic, in a sense? I think part of my struggle with this conversation is that artificial is so it's fundamental to the expression artificial intelligence, right? Like you can't just say intelligence and people understand what you mean. It's artificial intelligence, and artificial has so many connotations, right? Yeah, that would just be a kind of cool thought.
Well, here's a thought experiment, actually, talking back to that. Why couldn't you just say intelligence?
I think that there have been texts probably that have done this. In fact, I feel like there's one floating around at the back of my mind that just hasn't quite surfaced, where perhaps more along the lines of Iain M Banks' culture, where the minds, it's just a mind. It's not called a machine. It's not called specifically artificial. You get a sense that it's artificial because you get some of the background on how they were built and made. But they're not, they in and of themselves do not define themselves as artificial, as far as I know.
Yes.
Anyway, I think it's a little bit more natural of a presentation.
Yeah, that's actually really a good point. And since you mentioned the Culture series by Iain M Banks, when I think of the minds and I think of the drones that are present there, and granted it's been months and months and months since I picked up a Culture book, but I'm pretty sure that at least in the first book, or maybe the first few books, they're not referred to outright as artificial intelligences. The reason why I'm remembering this specifically is I remember once upon a time when I read those first books, I was actually confused about what they were, whether they were, biological minds that had been stored or amplified in some way through machines, or whether they were artificial intelligences. And I remember being confused about that. So my question of, couldn't we just call them something else, then sort of loses this bookmark in the science fictional cultural consciousness of what AI is and the history it traces and the things that we can access with that we couldn't otherwise. So it's one of those questions that I'm grappling with so many things right now, and part of it is not even defining what is artificial intelligence, what is intelligence, what is human, how do we keep those things separate, but rather as well thinking about questions of relationships. Do we think of the relations between intelligences instead of putting them in hierarchies or enacting boundaries, but also how do we go against what's been done? We can't insist that science fiction as a field, from the folks who win the big awards and write literarily down to sorry, that was totally a hierarchy. But
yeah, it was.
the folks who win big awards and write literary science fiction and everything, to the folks who write dime store science fiction pulp novels, how do we get everyone to shift to viewing artificial intelligence in a different way, or not using artificial intelligence, or whatever? That's impossible. The concept exists. And what do we do about that?
Yeah, and I think that on a fundamental level, science fiction authors just really can't resist the urge to tinker with the experiment of what's rock bottom human. And I think that it might be a science fictional problem simply because we're a little bit more free to play with the parameters. I mean, maybe not much more free than the average crime fiction author, because boy, do those things get wild.
Yeah.
But, I think science fiction specifically says, okay, you now have permission to do whatever you want, as long as you can at least throw in some language which provides a clue of how we got here, sort of a thing, or how this is different from the ordinary human story. But like maybe this is hard to talk about in part because we're talking about generalities. How about we talk about a couple specific examples of how artificial intelligence presents?
Sure.
Did you have one to start us off?
Yes. Let's talk about Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice and the series of books that come after. I have not actually read any of the books after Ancillary Justice. Have you?
I have not. We just picked them up for the library, so they're on my to-read list, but they are, let's just say that my to-read list is rather long because there's so many good books out there.
Right.
So they're up there, but they're not quite to the top yet of the peak.
Yeah.
Now, I would, based on the first book, propose an alternate title for Anne Leckie's Ancillary series, which is to call them the Tea Chronicles, because tea just fucking is everywhere. It's just everywhere. Like, everyone's drinking tea, whether they're on a planet or on a ship. People obsess over the brew and the water temperature and the aroma, and that the ritual of it actually is something that really helps bind the story together, and I think is fascinating. So if we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, I think we should also talk about how we humanize them. And in a lot of ways, the very simple act of serving tea in Ancillary Justice helps make the artificial intelligence accessible. Like, we all drink hot beverages at some point, whether it's coffee or tea or whatever. We all have our little habits and our little rituals.
Some of us boil soda. It's whatever.
Some of us boil soda. That would be completely rank. Please do not do that. But my larger point is that what's really attractive to me about Ancillary Justice is that the artificial intelligence is embodied, physically embodied in a ship, in its ancillaries, and in one particular ancillary who then goes by the name of Breck for much of the novel. And the little habits and the little rituals, they become clothing for this conversation between the embodied artificial intelligence and the peoples which it has been directed to both serve and govern. And I find it fascinating in part because Anne Leckie herself is just brilliant and wonderful. And she wrote an article for IO9, which we've plugged in the past. She wrote this several years ago now. But she wrote an article called Here's How Artificial Intelligence Might Really See the World. And it's essentially about split brain surgeries and experiments on, like, in our world, not like science fictional experiments, but real experiments about how the human body itself is alien. Like, our limbs might be alien to our own bodies. Like, we might have phantom limb syndrome, or we might have one of those surgeries which bisects the brain and prevents one side from communicating with the other, and so you can actually be of two minds about a thing. So she was thinking a lot about that and the actual physicality of being alien to oneself while she was writing Ancillary Justice and its sequels. And I just think that that's a different take, perhaps, than or a more on-the-nose physical approach to artificial intelligence than some of the others. I don't know. I've been rambling a bit. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a really interesting idea. It's kind of saying that artificial is not synthetic, not built, but just, I don't know, a part in some way. In the same way
A
that we
matter
might
of
say, like,
perspective, yeah.
alien intelligence. Like, maybe that's a better... I mean, maybe that's a way to describe what Ann Leckie is describing there.
Yeah.
And I brought this up in an earlier podcast, and I don't remember which one right now, but this question of when we're talking about the alien, whether the alien is unknown or unknowable. And unknown...
I believe that was the Southern Reach
Yeah,
podcast.
I think you're right. And I'm gonna, I believe, since I don't remember exactly what I said, I'm going to not rehash the entire thing, but just say when I mean unknown, I mean things that we don't know yet, but we can learn them, we have the capacity, we can find them. They're not like waiting to be known out there, but that is knowledge that could possibly manifest in futures. Versus...
it could be acquired.
Yes, yeah. Versus unknowable,
Okay.
which is just, could have no idea. Being, say, I don't know, the completely immersed perspective of a spider is unknowable for me, probably right now and forever, because I will never be a spider, and I will never, and I mean, that's why, if I can tangent just slightly, that's why when I was a kid, things like Animorphs were so foundational to me. And I mean, like, I'm interested in these things now because I read Animorphs back then, and Kay Applegate tried really to get inside the minds of animals and think about what it actually meant to be in the alien mind. So I have a long history here is what I'm getting at. But, you know, when we're talking about AIs, we're really still circling around this question of, are they alien or not? Can we just consider artificial intelligence another kind of alien? And I don't... I say that as though it's just like, oh, well, we solved AIs, now we can kick them to the curb, because I do think there's a difference there between alien and AI, but is AI a subset of alien, or are they completely different categories, or can they be both?
Well, I think probably both.
I think so too.
In fact, I'm looking at a list that I drew up earlier today of how the AI functions in relationship to the human in a variety of different science fictional texts, and it's just about as diverse a list as you might drop for what is alien in relationship to the human. Which is not to say that they're equivalent or that they are the same thing, but I think there are definitely parallels and perhaps downright convergences between what is alien and what is AI. And I think, like many other things that could conceivably be defined as human problems, they'll always be messily entwined and messily separated. I think perhaps you might say AI is a subset of the alien that manifests specifically in science fiction as a genre. So it's like a literary manifestation of the alien, whereas the alien and the other is common throughout all kinds of storytelling and all kinds of literature and all kinds of fantasies and nightmares. So I think that there's a little bit more of a broad reach to the alien than there is to the AI. In terms of where it's going to crop up, but that doesn't mean that they're not kind of the same thing in a sense, you know.
Yeah.
Like it would be a great, kind of like along the lines of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. It would be a great experiment to take a grand literary text that deals with the question of what is other, or what is alien, and just every time it's mentioned, sub in the robot said or. You know, that would be kind of interesting to me to see whether it read as science fiction or whether it broke something irreparably.
Yeah. So when you say alien and other, I'm getting, because this is an interesting question to me. And so I'm going to rephrase what I was starting to say and what then got broken. But, so we're talking about alien and we're talking about AI here, but going back to when you brought up Frankenstein, are we really in both ways talking about the other and therefore moving this conversation way beyond science fiction? And I feel like the first thing I promised was we're going to talk just about science fiction today, and now we're going to talk about the other forever. But
No,
really, I mean,
no.
is that what we're doing? Or, and you're starting to say no, so sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it poses specific complications, pleasurable complications in a lot of ways for science fiction readers and writers, that the other may or may not to other genres. I think, you know, my point about Anne Leckie and the embodiment of her characters, I don't think you could see something so artfully hybridized from other genres. I mean, it would be really hard to have a conversation about the other in a genre other than science fiction where we're talking about a split, like a multitude of bodies that are also the same person, and one person or one mind, one intelligence, which can conceivably be a ship, or an object, and be living in flesh at the same time. Like, I don't know how you could pull something like that off, except for maybe to experiment with split personalities, like to kind of get at the same kind of question in the other. I mean, you could have a straight up scientific text discussing the split mind surgeries that she does, or split brain surgeries, I should say, or phantom limbs and all that. But it's not going to be moving. It's not going to move us to understand ourselves the same way. Like, I think... And I think if we look at maybe a couple other examples, maybe we'll spiral closer to understanding how science fiction and artificial intelligence allow us to examine specific things that the other in broadly general literary fiction could not.
Well, let me provide a completely different example. So we've talked about Data from Star Trek. We've talked about Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, Iain M Banks' Culture series. You mentioned Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson. We talked about Battlestar Galactica. The Cylons in Battlestar Galactica are probably the closest we've gotten to evil AI. And there is a reason there. But one of the questions that we talked about prior to beginning recording is, why do we care at all? Like, is the main reason we're thinking about artificial intelligence, and the reason it sticks around, is that we're scared of giant robot overlords, like in The Matrix, or like we're afraid we're going to end up with HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Like, so let's maybe think about that, but also like shift to the opposite end of the spectrum and go to evil AI that are trying to kill us, and what they say about the other and the alien and AI more generally.
Yeah, like, I feel like AI in 2001: A Space Odyssey is doing something radically different from, say, Marvin in The Hitchhiker's Guide, where, like, Marvin is this cool sidekick. Well, maybe not. He doesn't think he's cool. He's
right.
Terribly depressed.
No one else thinks he's cool either.
No one else
I mean, in the
cool.
novel, in the world.
I do.
I do too.
Because if I was to spontaneously, like, manifest within the Hitchhiker's world, I'm pretty sure I would be Marvin. So like, Marvin is this really relatable character. Even though he's kind of, like, very much not human, he's also entirely, like, the epitome of human, right? Whereas Hal is supposed to be so inhuman and so unempathetic, to go back to my comment about empathy, that he can pretty much, like, doom an entire shipload of people or the entire human race. Like, honestly, it's not even a matter of scale. Like, it could be an ant or it could be the human race. And Hal would probably be like, yes, I am going to destroy you all. You know, like, it would just... So Hal and other evil AIs, and The Matrix is complicated on that, so we're not going to include that in the list of examples of, like, purely evil AIs. But they tend to be like desaturated depictions of, like, the psychotic, the human psychotic, and I think that's they're trying to get at something bigger than just, like, a cool psychic who's slightly weird. They're trying to represent aspects of the human psyche, and capture them within the the framework of this intelligence in such a way as to, in a very different way from Anne Leckie, embody the human experience, the human fear, perhaps. And like, you'll also have AIs that are more benevolent and maybe are on the opposite end of the spectrum from Hal, like AIs who come in and, like, the day the Earth stood still, is that the title of it?
Yeah, I think so.
Where the intelligence comes to Earth, surveys us in our flawed attempts to transcend ourselves, and says, you know what, you're not quite there yet, but we'll maybe give you a chance. You know, like, that's like the benevolent opposite to Hal, which says, like, you're broken and I'm going to fix you, and fixing you means annihilation.
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, the rambling has happened.
Yeah, well, it just, as you were saying some of that, I was remembering the short story I read by Harlan Ellison that I then taught when I was teaching a science fiction class called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, about...
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, the development of AI, and then, because you were thinking about the AI as psychotic, and essentially what this artificial intelligence does is it captures, what is it? It kills off most of humanity, everyone except for 5 people, and they live together basically under its non-existent thumb, and it tortures them for eternity until it kills them. I forget exactly what it does. It's been a while since I read it, and it was pretty goddamn dark, so I sort of forgot. I tried to forget it. But, you know, like, that seems like, as long as we're going along this road, like, even a step beyond HAL 9000, not that HAL would have been incapable of that based on what we were shown in 2001, but this is, like, the thought experiment taken to its logical extreme. This AI is, you know, embodying that fear of the psychotic and the unknowable and the alien other, and it kills everyone, and the only people it leaves alive are left alive to be tortured and experimented upon for whatever reasons. And that's, you know, that kind of exploration is kind of darkly, but I think in a similar vein to even what Data from Next Generation is doing, thinking about what it means to be human in a very, very different way. The thesis is just that to be human is something completely different, or at least it's looking at a very different aspect of what it means to be human, and maybe something we don't want to look at too closely, which is why I tried to forget that story.
Which is why we look at it obliquely, and by placing it within mechanical bodies, perhaps. You know, perhaps it's easier to contemplate the evils that we're capable of when we project them onto a blank slate, tabula rasa for evil, nefarious ends. But, like, I don't want to say that, I don't want to paint with too broad a stroke, because I made that mistake back in our podcast about The Expanse when we were talking about hard sci-fi. I don't want to paint with too broad of a stroke. I think the value of science fiction and what it allows us to do is in its nuance. And it actually reminds me of a fantastic interview carried out with Kim Stanley Robinson, and I believe it first aired on Public Radio International. And this was surrounding the release of KSR's book Aurora, which features Ship, which I already mentioned, which is an artificial intelligence, which is it learns how to tell stories over the course of the novel. And KSR said that what science fiction is good at is doing scenarios. Science fiction may never predict what is really going to happen in the future because that's too hard. Strange things, contingent things happen that can't be predicted, but we can see trajectories. And so, in a sense, every artificial intelligence is one trajectory being plotted out by one author or one creative team in the case of a television show. And in the case of something like Star Trek, you have lots of chances to keep kind of plotting out new trajectories along the same premise that artificial intelligence exists. And so you get different results. But in texts like 2001: A Space Odyssey, you get one artificial intelligence. And so it has to carry a lot more weight than than Data does, in a sense, because Data is one artificial intelligence among many. Even though he's a central one, there are other possible results to the experiment. And so, I think structurally artificial intelligence gives us a microcosm within the larger experiment of science fiction. And we can control the parameters on it even more tightly than we do within a science fictional world. It comes down to yes and yes, yes and no, no and no. It's all true and it's all false.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's true. And I guess where I want to go for the remainder of this podcast then is maybe back to some of the stuff we thought about for our Burn Baby Burn podcast when we talked about dystopias. There's so many different ways to do AI, from questioning the very term itself and its relation to what is not artificial intelligence to, the grand operatic movements of AI is always evil and it's something we should watch out for, to AI is always good and it's something we should strive for, and everything in the middle. But why are we, this is really the why do we care question again, but what does AI allow us to do as readers and as writers that really makes it powerful that other things can't do?
Well, could I speak from personal experience?
Of course. Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm working on a manuscript and I'm at the revision stage. I'm about a quarter of the way through the revision. And this is the first of a perceived series. I'm plotting out the series in my mind and it spans multiple generations and all that, good science fictional stuff. And the first book is more constrained by what I would call hard science fiction, which is a future which could conceivably happen, based on the technologies we have available to us now and the current course of events in certain things. And there's no artificial intelligence in this particular iteration, in this particular installment. Artificial intelligence is not something that I've rolled out for future books, but I'm finding that I run up against a wall when I'm writing this AI-less universe of science fiction, and that I don't have a neat and simple canvas to explore this idea of what is rock bottom human, unless I want to go the direction of turning it into a crime novel or something along those lines. So I think artificial intelligence for an author is super convenient. It can be hard. I'm not saying it's not hard to do AI well, but I think it's a convenient vehicle for exploring certain questions of identity and purpose and meaning, and value and empathy and relationships. So it gets a lot of work done with a simple and containable framework. Yeah, that would be kind of what I would say from personal experience as an author. As a reader, I have always been fascinated by the AI, but I don't think it would be enough to draw me to a text if that was the central novum. And we've talked about novums in the past. I think there has to be more for me to fall in love with a world, but it is useful in fleshing that world out to me. So, ancillary justice, I was hesitant at first because it focuses almost exclusively on the perspective of an AI character. And I thought, oh, is this going to be all that there is? Constant, self-masturbatory, exploration of who am I? But it turns out that it's far more complicated than that. And Anne Leckie is incredibly graceful in how she manages the purpose of the AI in her text. There's a lot more going on than just the like angsty teen kind of bemoaning his fate at the bottom of the universe. So I don't know. What do you think?
I want to direct us back to Frankenstein, which you so wonderfully gave us earlier in the podcast. You gave us that example earlier in the podcast because I think AI, and this may be true of science fiction more generally, depending upon the way that you're reading it or writing it or the way that it has been written. But I think that what AI texts allow us to do really powerfully is explore our relationship with technology. And obviously not all technology, but, and I say going back to Frankenstein because essentially that's what Mary Shelley did. Frankenstein is an exploration of technology, just, very different than what we think today probably. And of course, I'm not the first person to say this by any means, I'm sure. But I think one of the real strengths of AIs are that we can think about things like the fact that I'm surrounded by computers right now. I'm looking at a computer, I have a computer on my lap in my phone, I have another computer to my left, I have a computer behind me, and, I'm using the traditional kind of like monitor thing here, but I also have the microphone I'm recording into, I have a camera on my desk, like I have an external hard drive, and now I'm just looking around, look at the printer, all of these things. And this is just the electronic technology, to say nothing of the reliance I have upon all the fucking books on my bookshelves that also surround me. So I don't want to turn this into a meditation on what technology is, but rather to say that by giving a voice to technology, we are basically moving away from the kind of angsty thing you just described that ancillary justice does not do, but we can, instead of just talking to ourselves, we can actually talk to our technology because it is intelligent, artificially so, maybe, but it can talk back to us and we can relate to it. And that sort of dialogic relationship where you can say something and then the artificial intelligence can say something back, whether that something is, let me take care of you, or I'm going to kill you and your entire species, that allows us to dynamically interact with technology in a way that no other genre and no other subgenre of science fiction allows. And I think that's definitely not the power of AI texts specifically, but I think it's definitely one of the powers, and maybe one of the most important powers.
Agreed. And I think, for better or worse, science fiction and the conversation about technology have become somewhat wedded together in people's minds. It's not to say that other genres can't explore this relationship, but it seems to be the special province of sci-fi in all of its different forms. And man, did you ever get around to seeing the movie Her?
No, I haven't done yet.
So it has now been roughly a full year since I first got on your case about not having seen it. I think it is exactly everything that you've just been saying, almost to the point where I'm tempted to say don't watch it because you've already got the point. And that's really where the movie is trying to bring people, is to understand that the dialogic between technology and us, and the distinctions. It's a little bit less concerned with what is artificial than it is with how do we relate to other consciousnesses and other intelligences, and how does this relationship help build us as people and build our narratives. It's a really interesting piece of work and piece of art. So, I have conflicted feelings on that now. So, are there any texts that we haven't discussed yet which have something important to say about artificial intelligence and perhaps what we can do with it?
I am certain that there are so many texts that we have not mentioned and bear talking about, but as far as our conversation today about artificial intelligence, I feel pretty good with the things that we've said. I think that we, at least from my perspective, touched on the artificial intelligences that I think are most important to me, and have been most foundational in how I think about thinking about AI.
So, any homework for our listeners today?
I would just remind them that we can be found many places on this great, not yet artificially intelligent interweb of ours. You can listen to us directly either on SoundCloud or on iTunes or the podcast app if you have an Apple phone. Just search for the Imaginaries and there will be. We're also on YouTube with all of our back episodes. Again, if you just search the Imaginaries, you'll see us listed episode by episode. You can go to our website, which is www.imaginaries.us, to find out how to get to each of those things, because we always have links, and Kendra always has some very fun ramblings about what we happen to have talked about recently.
Know.
And finally, you can follow us on Twitter at imaginary_pod, where we will also talk about what we're posting, and if we interview anyone, we will tag them. Whenever we talk about specific text, we'll tag those authors and bookstores that we like, and yada yada yada. We retweet a lot. We retweet a lot of things, and our Twitter is just generally a fun place to be. I think, coming as someone who does not use Twitter.
What are you talking about? You're never on Twitter.
Well, but it's fun.
Okay.
Ours is fun.
We will take a good stab also at linking the interviews and articles we talk about during our podcast.
Yes.
On our blog, our very, very basic blog, which will probably remain basic for some time because I am terrible. So thank you for listening today. And if you have any thoughts about AI, big gaps in our understanding that we just weren't able to fill today, or questions or comments or suggestions for further reading or watching, we would love to hear from you. I'm thinking specifically about the drought of AI-related texts. I would like to, outside of Anne Leckie, who I will read at some point, I would like to seed a little bit more of my reading list with this particular kind of material. So send me your suggestions. And we'll catch you next week for another lovely imaginary discussion.
Indeed.
This is all in your head.
Indeed.
This is all in your head.
Indeed we will. Enjoy the collective hallucination next week.
Yeah. Have a great life, people.
And out.
And out.